Okay, let's read. We're going to go back a little bit. All right. The school felt in the South run by N-words. Yeah, that's the bad thing. The American Freedmen's Commission reports that black people, quote, attempts at education provoked the most intense and bitter hostilities as evincing a desire to render themselves equal to the whites. Their churches and schoolhouses in many places were destroyed by mobs. See? That's what, like, all right, here we go. Here's what they do. N-word teachers was one of the most opprobrious epithets. Let's find out what that word is. I know I probably talked about it yesterday, but oh well. A-P-P-R. Wait, no, I-P-P. A-P-P-R. What's O-P-P? What am I doing? Oh, God. B-R-I-O-U-S. Okay, here it is. Opprobrious. Opprobrious is an adjective used to describe language, behavior, or actions that express severe scorn or harsh criticisms or utter contempt. Opprobrious. Opprobrious epithets that the Southern vocabulary furnished. Even in the North, this prejudice existed among some of the avowed friends of the freed people, and it is a singular act that one of the earlier freemen's aid societies was rent asunder by the unwillingness of the part of its members to cooperate in any movement looking towards the education of black people, though they were willing to provide him with food and clothing in order to prevent suffering and death. The teachers who went down from the North were soon disillusioned, if they were at all influenced by any other than the most serious missionary spirit. Obscurantism is a mild term for the de-estimate with which they were regarded as N-word teachers. Okay, I'll bring you up, Fatima, but I don't think you're going to get that much coins. The white people of Virginia, this is a quote, the white people of Virginia were shocked at the efforts of northern philanthropists, sorry, to educate black people. The papers sneer at them. There were some gradual change of sentiments among the better class of whites in Virginia, but still the mass of whites remained bitterly opposed to the schools, and some had become brutal. Teachers were proscribed and ill-treated. Schoolhouse burned, and threats so strong that many schools could not be open, and others, after the brief struggle, had to be closed. See what white people do? I don't like it. They've been socialized to hate black people. In Virginia, I heard a man who did not know who I was make a remark in reply to something that had been said about establishing a school at Whiteyville for the teaching of children of color. He said that he hoped that the, quote, damned rascals who teach N-words would be shot. In disgusting people, right? In North Carolina, instances are found where persons who taught in black schools were assaulted, schoolhouses burned, and threats made against the lives of those engaged in the work. 2 women school teachers who were recently sent from Wilmington in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to establish a school for children of color, were informed by the sheriff of the county that they could not be allowed to start their schools, nor would they be allowed to land. But they might remain on a steamer until her return to Wilmington. Inasmuch as they were women, if they were men, they would receive such treatment as was awarded to such meddlesome characters before the war. In South Carolina, General Saxton said that teachers of color, schools throughout the state gave it as their opinion they would be unable to remain there for a day, but for the protection of the United States troops. In Mississippi, bitter opposition was manifested against black schools. Men of color, in some instances, themselves gave the money to prepare and furnish a school, and then were forbidden to use it. Quote, four young men in Adams County conspired to murder the teachers of black schools. They maltreated him somewhat barbarously. One wondered just what, quote, somewhat barbarously would be. In Louisiana, it was said, quote, if military protection were withdrawn, our schools would cease. Conway said in Louisiana, 1866, the feeling there is unanimous, that they shall not own an acre of land or have any schools. They are more hostile to the establishment of schools than they are to owning land. They had broken up some of our schools at the time of my departure, and since then I have official reports from those who have charged of the schools that upon the withdrawal of the military from the parishes of St. Mary and, oh my gosh, La Fortune, the freedmen's schoolhouses in those parishes were before night burnt or pulled down. The schools disbanded and the teachers frightened away. In many regions, this opposition was very presented. Along the coast, it was usually tacked and suppressed. Their teachers and school for black people were ignored. But in the intersphere of Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Maryland, it was given full and free expression. Black people were dispossessed, and their school building teachers were not allowed to enter upon their duties, and churches and schoolhouses were sometimes burned. A few voices cried in the wilderness that a due regard for the public weal imperatively requires that black people be educated, taught at least to read and write. Steeped in ignorance, they can never be made to understand the responsibility that rests upon them as freemen. That's bullshit. I hate that. But others only admitted that, quote, the sole aim should be to educate every white child in the Commonwealth, end quote. And here's another quote. I am in favor of providing ways and means for the education of freemen, but not in favor of positively imposing upon the legislator an unqualified and imperative duties of educating any but the superior race of man, the white race. Our pecuniary condition does not allow us to do it. I'm gonna look this word up. These people are disgusting. They're disgusting people. Fayetteville. Thank you. Looking up a word, making sure I'm saying it right. I tried it. Let me see if I said it right. Pecuniary. Wait. Pecuniary. Related to consisting of a measure in money. Pecuniary condition does not allow us to do it. Often this objection took an even more ungracious form. I say that the levying of a tax upon us to pay for the education for a race we expected not to be torn from us is an indignity. Why are we called upon to educate these black people? No, sir, it will never be so dishonest as to disgrace myself by such a vote. Disgusting people. These in the midst of these efforts of black people, the general opposition of whites came the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau found many schools for freemen already in existence, maintained by tax commissioners, by black people, and by the army. The original Freedmen's Bureau Act made no provisions for black education, but notwithstanding this, the fraud derives from the rent of abandoned property, was used for education, and government buildings were turned into schoolhouses. Transportation was given to teachers and subsistence granted. By Act of 1866, the educational powers of the Bureau were greatly enlarged. Corporations with benevolent associations, teachers and agents was sanctioned. and buildings leased. The sum of $521,000 was appropriated for schools' purposes, and other sums provided by the scale of lease of property formerly belonging to the Confederate government. Teachers were sent from the North, and the Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and especially the Congregationalists took part. The efforts thus begun in the army and by philanthropists, philanthropists, and taking up later by the Freedmen's Bureau, expanding into a system which penetrated the whole South, although naturally it touched but a fraction of a black population. I know sometimes my words just won't say the damn word. Like I'll try to do it with my tongue just doesn't want to. All right. Between 1865 June 1st and September 1st, 1870, the Bureau spent on education a sum which represented about 1/2 of the expenses of the schools. The rest was met by benevolent association and of the freedmen themselves. For some years after 1865, the education of black people was sustained by the northern churches, an organization allied with them. Schools of all grades, from kindergarten to college, were established in each state. The Freedmen's Bureau alone appropriated $3,521,934 to schools from the 1868 to 1870, while the churches and societies spent $1,572,287 during the same period. Quote, among the northern teachers were many men and women of unusual sincerity, of purpose, zealous as only religious enthusiasts can be. The black people was only responsive to efforts in his behalf as far as his economic conditions would permit. It is nevertheless both interesting and astonishing to realize that during 1860 to 1870, the freedmen contributed in cash $785,700 to their schools. In 1866, Alvord, the superintendent of education under the Freedmen's Bureau, reported that in 11 former slave states and the District of Columbia, there was 90,589 black pupils and 1,314 teachers in 740 schools from 1865 to 1866. Teachers in the black elementary school were almost exclusively northern whites. Gradually, black teachers came to be used. The annual amount which the Bureau voted to schools proposed purposes increased from $27,000 in 1865 to nearly $1 million in 1870, and reached a total in 1865 to 1870 of $5,262,511.26. In July 1870, there were 4,239 schools under their supervision, with 9,307 teachers and 247,333 pupils. Notwithstanding this, of the 1.7 million black children of school age in 1870, only about one-tenth were actually in school. The public school system in most southern states began with an enfranchisement of black people. For instance, in South Carolina, the Constitution of 1868 was a notable departure in the educational history of the state. Not only was education mentioned for the first time in an organic law, but the state, for the first time, was given the outline of the educational system in keeping with the advanced thought of the age. The General Assembly was obligated to establish a system of universal education as soon as practical. Perhaps no state illustrates the relations of black people and the public school system better than South Carolina. And the story of the debate in the Convention of 1868 is worth following. On Saturday, June 18, 1868, Beverly Nash, a person of color, offered a resolution on education, and A.J. Rancer on Tuesday, January 22nd, presented another solution which read, quote, resolved that the Committee on Education inquired into the expediency of the establishing a board of education consisting of 3 from each congressional districts. Such boards shall have power to divide the state into school districts and provide for a thorough system of common schools, each a superintendent from among their numbers, and making all needful regulations for the education of youth. No distinction to be made in favor of any class of persons. So, like, this is an establishment of public schools. The commit and they're so Christian. They're Christian, like they have essence of Christianity within inside those. You know. Oh yeah. I have no idea who's finding. Okay, whatever. Okay. The Committee of Education was named January 20th of F.L. Cardozo, a black leader, was chairman. 3 white men and 5 men of color served on the committee. Robert Smalls of, quote, Planter fame desired that a system of public schools be established and that they be open to all classes of people. And he got a hair in my mouth. And he wanted compulsory education. B.F. Randolph wanted institutions for the mentally ill, I guess I can say, blind, deaf, and cannot speak. The poor fostered and supported by the state. The matter of compulsory attendance brought considerable discussion. Rensselaer, afterwards congressman, supported compulsory attendance, contending that ignorance was the cause of vice and degradation, and that civilization and enlightenment were the consequences of the schoolmasters. And if force was necessary to secure the benefits of education, it ought to be restored too. 1 or 2 able black people were against the compulsory feature, but 2 white delegates were in favor of it. One of them, Gilson, said, in South Carolina, where there has been any system of free public schools, there is 1 person in every 8 who cannot read and write. Finally, it was decided that the compulsory feature should not be insisted upon until a thorough and complete system had been organized. The Constitution was ratified, provided for the establishment of universal education as soon as practical and for compulsory attendance for all children between the ages of 6 and 16. But this was not to become effective until the system had been completely organized. It provided for a normal school and a school for the deaf, cannot speak, and blind. After the termination of the convention, the General Assembly enacted a law to provide for contemporary organization of the education department. In November 20th, 1869, one year after this, K.G. Gilson made a report on the school situation completely because many counties had not reported. There were, at that date, 16,418 children in schools, of whom 8,255 were white and 8,165 were people of color, students of color. There were 381 schools with 528 teachers. Among the teachers, 50 were people of color. The temporary act proved inadequate, and the Governor Scott urged in November 1869 an efficient and comprehensive law. This led to the Act of February 16, 1870. And here's what it says. To establish and maintain a system of free school for the state of South Carolina, an examination of its provisional reveals that it is no gross exaggeration to state that it was most comprehensive and most beneficial legislation to state of South Carolina was ever enacted. Textbooks were to be provided at cost or free to poor. January 4th, 1980, there were 30,448 children in 769 schools and the average pay for the teachers were $35 a month. The superintendent complained of the inexperience of the school officers, want of suitable schoolhouses, scarcity of good teachers, and the apathy and opposition to the new system, and also of the inadequacy of the appropriation. Besides this, there was deep prejudice against mixed schools. The public press of the state had held the whole educational system up to ridicule, abused officials, and belittled their efforts, or else had remained silent. The number of people of color pupils attended schools in 1869 was 8,136. In 1870, there was 15,894. The number of white pupils in 1869 was 8,255. In 1870, 11,112. The repeated failure of the part of the state to meet in full its appropriation for school purposes had been a fruitful source of score and perplexity to these officers, and a very serious determinant to the cause. Evidently, the, quote, school system was operated in the most inefficient manner, and there was a gross misappropriation of the school funds. From year to year, Gilson was able to report progress. When he left the office in 1876, there were 1,235 students attending 1,776 schools taught by 3,069 teachers, and the school revenue was $457,260. We may assume that had the Reconstruction government not been overthrown in 1877, it would have given the state an excellent school system. F.J. Moses, Jr., while governor, said, "No greater eulogy can be written upon the reconstructed administration of the government in South Carolina than that when it came into power, it was a stationary offense against the law of the land to impart even the rudiment of the common school education to the South Carolinian, because forsooth he was black, while the reconstructed government was made in a sanctuary offense to hinder or prevent any child in the state, or whoever color, from abstaining the common school education. Nay, we have even gone further and demanded by our Constitution that their attendance at school be compulsory." Hold on a second, everybody. Let me do something real quick. The Reconstruction Constitution of Georgia in 1868 provided for a, quote, thorough system of general education to be forever free to all children of the state, the details to be worked out by the legislature. In August 1869, the Georgian Teacher Association, composed of white and teachers of color, met for the first time in Atlanta. The subject of public education was thoroughly discussed, and a plan proposed by which the educational provisions of the Constitution could be put into operations. It was not until 1870 that the legislature took up the subject. Particularly all of the black senators and representatives introduced bills on education. Senator Campbell, who was one of the group that met Stanton and Sherman at Savannah, presented a bill asking for a thorough system of public education. He also presented a very lengthy resolution describing how the money for education was to be secured. White Georgia, however, long resisted the establishment of public school systems. The first public school law was enacted in October 1870 and amended in 1872. Its details were the result of recommendations made by a committee of the Georgian Teachers Association. The plan was more elaborate than that of 1866 and had a state school commissioner and a state board education. And a special school fund was provided. There would be separate schools for white and black people, but equally facilitates. Faculties. The first public school was taught in the state during the summer of 1871. Schools were superintended in 1872 because of reaction to the alleged lack of funds. In 1871, there was $500,000 in the school fund, but the legislature had diverted it to other purposes. Of course they did. The schools were put in operations in 1873 and 1874. There were 1,379 schools for whites and 356 for black people. Sounds like that's like what happens in like Africa. Like they have like when they talk about like medical services, they like and they talk about this too. Like if you read how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he goes through the education of underdevelopment and how it remains underdeveloped, and he goes through like the underdevelopments of healthcare. And like it's the same thing. Like it provides more for white people, for the settlers, than it provides for anybody else. It's a fucking like this is like the copy of what they're gonna do. Jesus. You can like see like the roots of all these things, it feels like. In a coincidence that the passage of the Act of 1870 came on 100th anniversary of a previous act passed by Georgia's legislature, making it penal to teach a black person to write or read. This quote, "This was a great day for Georgia. Peanut butter super soaker." Oh, okay, great. There were over a 500,000 black people in the state, and less than 1% of them were able to read and write. And in 1870, and that's not their fault. That's because of slavery. Perhaps not over 500 people of color, when the public schools were open, were more or less capable of taking charge of a primary school. In 1870, 6,664 children of color were enrolled in private schools, while in 1880, after 10 years of free schools, the enrollment of children of color was 86,399. But by that time, too, most of them were taught by teachers of color. Although, along with the public school system, there were 3,719 pupils in private schools and a few in college, making a total of enrollment in 1880 as 97,174. A new state constitution of Mississippi in 1868 made it the duty of the legislature to establish, quote, "a uniform system of free public schools by taxation or otherwise for all children between ages 5 and 21 years. For this, the only free school in the state were those maintained out of the proceeds arising from the scale or lease of the so-called 16th section land granted to the state by Congress in the early part of the century. But as most of these lands had been lost by mismanagement, the number of such schools was not very large. The Reconstruction Convention was thoroughly imbued with the idea of education for all. The Constitution made it the duty of the legislature to encourage by all suitable means of promotion of intellectual scientific morals. The culture of improvement by establishing a uniform system of public schools for all children between the ages of 5 and 21 years, constitutional provisions was made for a permanent school fund, and the legislature was empowered to levy a poll tax not exceeding $2 per capita. Many difficulties were encountered in the early life of Mississippi. New school systems, and its progress was slow. Objections to black education were early apparent. The school's report of 1873 says, quote, "Again, it is objected that the general tax compels white men of the state to educate the children of black people. But as black people forms a majority of the entire population of the state, and in an eminent degree, a majority of the producing classes, such as classes of every population, of every population, the labor, tenant, and consumer, indirectly bear the burdens of taxation. It follows that an assessment upon the property of the state would be principally paid by black people, and therefore the ground of complaint, if any, against the general tax is with people of color and not with white people. During the first years of free education in Mississippi, State Superintendent Pease reported that more than 3,000 free schools have been opened with the attendance of 66,257 pupils. Of the 3,500 teachers employed, while except 399 were white. The total expenditure for public education for the year exceeding the government expenditures for all other purposes. Alabama in 1850, out of 176,657 persons, 5 through 20 years of age, reported 62,728 pupils, mostly the private academies and pay schools, which meant that the bulk of the white poor had no schools. The established public schools were without a state board, and in 1854 spent only $2.50 a year on each enrolled pupil. The public school system of Alabama was established by the state constitution of 1867 and organized in the following year. It was in continual financial difficulties owing to the better opposition of the whites, irregularities, and defalcation. I'm gonna look at this word. It's a word. I'm gonna see if I even said it right. Oh, well, let me say it. It's a misappropriation, misuse, a failure to properly account for money or funds entrusted to someone's care. So they're misappropriating shit. Fucking wild. Oh my gosh, I can't say it. I'll have to go through a commercial. Yep. Defalcation. All right. Defalcation in the educational department were charged. And finally, owing to the lack of funds and non-payment of taxes, as well as other conditions, the school closed in 1873 as a result of the triumph of reaction. But the demand for education was now strong, and the effect of the Northern opinion too great, so that the new constitution made by the Democrats in 1875 kept something of the system, but abolished the Board of Education and sought, as far as possible, to return to the antebellum status. Antebellum, A-N-T-E, bellum, status. Separate schools for the races were ordered. The administrative expenses were reduced. No money was to be paid to any denominational schools or private schools. Of the constitutional provision of 1/5 of the state revenue for schools' use was abolished. The United States Commissioner of Education gave a disapproving account of these changes and said it was exchanging, quote, a certainty for an uncertainty, end quote. This was in fact a restoration of education to local reactionary control and cutting off all higher training for black people for public health. Alabama felt the results of this narrow policy for many years. The Freedmen's Bureau schools in the state reached only a small portion of black people, and there were a few missionary schools. Quote, it is likely that for 5 years there were not more than 200 Northern teachers in the state, and a majority of the white people were hostile towards the education of black people. In Florida, a school in Fernandia, I can't say it, was established. It's a district in Florida, in a county. I think, was established in 1862 by Reverend Dr. Burroughs, who was superintendent with a half a dozen white Northern teachers. In Jacksonville, an Odd Fellows Hall was seized by a United States Provost General, turned over to Dr. Burroughs for a school building. Here, a school was opened both for black people and for whites. When the white children remonstrated against attending school with black children, Mr. Hawks, the lady principal, said, quote, "Very well, children of color will be educated, even if you will not," end quote. It is reported that this type of argument provided effective, and the two races got along harmoniously in schools for a time. Several disturbing factors prevented this experiment in democracy from continuing. First, the schools were built upon military force and outside workers, rather than the community itself. And secondly, public education was new to Florida, and it came at the time when it could least afford to have it from the point of view of finances and personnel. Schools were closed in 1864, but education continued in federal military camps. Black schools began again under the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, helped by missionaries, societies, including two groups of color, and the AME Church and the African Colonization Society of New York. The Constitution of 1865 under Johnson, Reconstruction, established a uniform system of education without specific provisions. There were 30 schools at the close of 1865. A committee of black people recommended immediate education for black people, but the legislature of 1866 compromised by establishing a state system of black schools under which black people were to pay their own schools. E.B. Duncan eventually became superintendent of both the state and the Freedmen's Bureau. The system of schools was based on the plan of making the poor pay for their own education. The schools for freemen were to be supported by a tax of $1 upon all male persons of color, between 1 and 55 at a tuition fee to be collected from each pupil, and the fee for a teacher's certificate, $5. Was also to go to school and fund for freemen. The superintendent was to establish schools for the freemen when the number of children of persons of color in any county or counties should warrant it. Quote, provided the funds provided for shall be sufficient to meet the expense thereof. The freemen themselves erected schoolhouses and provided further school funds. Some good schools were established under the superintendency of the Reverend A.B. Duncan, an able and conscientious man who worked hard to establish schools of color in every county. Quote, at that time, railroad facilities were very poor, and I have known him to walk from county to county in South Florida to establish schools of color, end quote. Gradually, the Bureau schools were absorbed into the state system, although the Bureau was the paramount authority during the period of military rule, 1866 to 1867. Under black suffrage came the law of 1869, and, quote, all of Florida's educational historians grant that this was a real beginning of the public school system in this state. Near the end of the radical Republican administration, conditions in education among black people of Florida were improved. The field of primary education was virgin. 71,000 inhabitants over 10 years of age were illiterate. 18,000 of them were white. But at the end of the 1870s, 331 schools were open with 14,000 pupils in attendance. 1/3 of them were black people. Probably the most outstanding character in the early life of Florida public school system was a black This is Black Jonathan C. Gibbs, whose colorful and efficient career has been noted in chapter 12. After acting as Secretary of State for 3 years, he was appointed late in 1872 Superintendent Public Instruction, an office which he held until his death of 1874. It was then a post of considerable difficulty, as the first enthusiasm for a new school system had subsided. The political implications and embarrassment about school funds had come in to hinder progress. But by his energy and enthusiasm in the cause he so far succeeded that in the month of August 1873, he had the pride and pleasure of saying before the National Education Association, quote, "The census of 1860 antebellum shows that Florida had in her schools 4,486 pupils at an expense of $75,412. Today, Florida has 18,000 pupils in a school that at the expense of $101,820, fully 4 times as many pupils at an increase of only 33% expenses. In 1876, when the Republicans were driven from power, 676 public schools have been established with 28,444 pupils, black and white, costing $158,846.36. In North Carolina, black people early pushed towards public education. There have been private schools for free black people before the war, and they had the example of John Chavis, who studied at Princeton and at what is now Washington and Lee University. Among his white pupils were at United States senators, a governor of the state, and the son of the Chief Justice. All accounts agreed with John Chavis as it was a gentleman, end quote. When the law stopped him from teaching white students, he taught a school for free black people in Raleigh. Is that Raleigh? I think it's Raleigh. In 1867, it was reported that many instances had come to notice where the teachers of the self-supported black schools had been sustained until the last cent of freemen command was exhausted, and where these last had even drawn on their credit in the coming crops to pay the bills necessary to keep up the schools. The most severe critics of Reconstruction must admit that the Convention of 1868 and the legislature of 1868 to 1869 set up a fine school system for North Carolina. So far as it could. The poverty of the state made the realization of these systems immediately an impossibility. But no one can, quote, place it at the door the laxity and grift of the administrative officers, which afterwards characterized the Department of Public Construction. Their work was to provide a system of public schools for the state of North Carolina, and this they did. Quote, "The only error with which one may charge them is that they did not set up a system calling for a separate school for black people and white children. And many people there are who could not class this as an error." Article 9 of the new Constitution, the section dealing with education, made provisions for the general system of public schools with tuition fees to all persons between the ages 6 and 21. The counties were to be divided into school districts, in which at least one school must exist and run for a minimum term of 4 months. The entire state system was to be governed by the Board of Education, composed of the governor of the state and lieutenant governor, and the Secretary of State, the Treasury. the superintendent of public works, the auditor of the superintendents of public instruction, and the attorney general. The money to support this system was to come from appropriation, from the state treasury, from the county taxation, certainly fines from the court, and certain other funds, such as the pre-war literary fund. Quote, school laws were more thoroughly set forth than at any other time in history of the state, end quote. S.S. Ashley, a northern white man who favored mixed schools, was selected superintendent. The new superintendent of public instruction made his first report to the status of education in North Carolina in November 1868. The new school laws had just been passed, and sufficient time had been elapsed for any considerable amount of constructive work to be accomplished. The act authorized the organization of a system of schools was not passed until April 1869. $100,000 was appropriated chiefly to come from the poll tax. This report showed that there was a total of 330,581 children between the ages of 6 and 21 in the state. Of this number, 223,815 were white and 106,766 were black people. There were 1,900 schoolhouses or buildings being used for school purposes, of which 178 could be definitely classed as good, quote unquote, and 685 were just as definitely to be thought as a quote bad. The remainder of the buildings were probably neither very good nor particularly bad, on the assumption that the legislator would appropriate the $100,000 called for in the school law. Superintendent Ashley apportioned this sum among the counties. The capitation? That can't be capitation. What the hell? Oh, wrong button. I probably have it right. Who knows? This is part of the dyslexia.
Capitation.
Yeah, I was right. Capitation. A payment model used primarily in healthcare where doctors or hospitals receive a fixed upfront fee per patient for a specific period. Capitation taxes was supposed to supplement this so that the total from the state to the counties was reckoned at $165,209.50, or 50 cents per census child. This was only an apportionment as the first money out of the state treasury, which actually went for the support of public education, was not yet distributed. Ashley's second report, issued in the autumn of 1869, gave one an idea of a general situation, and is especially helpful to the matter of black education, as it contains the report of the Reverend Johnson Wesley Hood, a black person who had been appointed as an assistant superintendent of public instruction in charge of the black schools. J.W. Hood, afterward bishop in the AME Zion Church, that's not Zionist, it's just a Zion, had been given his position by the Board of Education. But it appears that no legal provisions had been made for his office. It called attention to this report. Ashley simply states that he had been secured as an agent of the Board of Education and as an assistant and superintendent of public instruction. Hood had visited every section of the state in compiling his report, and Ashley asked that attention be given to it, quote, as it represents a more intelligent and complete view of the work of education among people of color population and the state has yet been given. Hood reported that there were 257 black schools with the enrollment of 15,674, chiefly carried on by churches and missionary societies. Ashley estimated 25,000 pupils of color in all. But the financial support of the public schools was bad. It improved, however, by 1872, that year, $412,070 was appropriated, and the property tax helped to raise the funds. Just as success seems to incite, the Democratic Party in North Carolina entered upon its historic policy of white control. The result of the return of the whites to power were soon shown. In 1870, the salary of a superintendent of public instruction was reduced from $2,400 to $1,500, and his appropriation for travel and clerks cut off. The state lost the service of both Ashley and Hood. From yet another quarter has black education to receive a blow in the same year. They just cannot allow them to have their success. The legal life of the Freedmen's Bureau had expired before this time. The agents had remained in the field, winding up its affairs. The last of the reports dealing with the educational work of the Bureau is dated July 1870. The very fact that it was generally disliked by the Southern whites is testimony in favor of its effectiveness. And though it did not antagonize the whites on the question of educating black people, it stood behind the schools for these same black people until such time as they had become pretty well established. Without the support of the Bureau, it is doubtful if any of these schools for black people would have existed very long. Reasons of local hostilities and financial stringencies make this seem probable. The professors of the faculty at the University of North Carolina, Alexander McEver, was appointed by a new governor to fill out the unexpired term of Ashley. McIver served in this position until January 1st, 1875, when he was succeeded by Stephen P. Poole. Poole promptly stole the money of the Peabody Fund entrusted in his care, proving that theft in North Carolina was not confined to black people or carpetbaggers. He was removed from office the following year. They just cannot get a break. In 1872, there were 119,083 white pupils and 55,000 people of color pupils in the school. For a long time, there was continual fear of mixed schools, but an amendment to the Constitution finally eliminated this. In Virginia, the Constitutional Convention of 1867 and 1868 had 25 black people, and they of some of the whites were eager to educate the children. The attempt to establish a public school system was vigorously opposed by the reactionaries. With the backing of black people, the Constitution provided for a uniform system of public schools to be established no later than 1867. This was adopted by the voters of 1869, and W.H. Ruffiner became superintendent of public instruction in 1871. The Constitution did not provide for separate schools, but the law under it did, and the support of the schools was to be obtained from the corporation tax of $1 and a small property tax. The first schools were opened in 1870, and by the end of the year, there was 2,900 schools with 130,000 pupils and 3,000 teachers. Of these, 706 were black schools with 38,554 pupils. The black people were eager for the schools, but the whites were largely indifferent. There was a scarcity of black teachers, and many white teachers were used. In Arkansas, there was a so-called school system before the war, but the governor in 1860 called it, quote, radically defective, end quote, and noted, quote, only 25 common schools organized and kept up with the whole state from the common school funds. The beginning of popular education in Arkansas, where under the Reconstruction government of 1868, black people themselves, after 1865, established the first free schools in Arkansas. Notice that the first free schools in Arkansas by black people. This they did at Little Rock, where after paying tuition for a short time, they formed themselves into an educational association, paid by subscription the salaries of teachers, and made the schools free. In July 1865, General Sprague appointed William M. Colby, General Superintendent of Refugees and Freemen, to cooperate with the state authorities, and if possible. Little progress was made in black education under the lessee system, and Colby had little to build on. Many Arkansas whites did not approve education under the Bureau because they feared it encouraged social equality. Of course they did. Can't have equality. Under the Freedmen's Bureau, black people built schoolhouses and sometimes furnished as much as 33% of the cost of instruction. This civil government did little towards the encouragement of black education. As has been stated earlier, little free school education was furnished for anyone. The legislature of Arkansas on July 2nd, 1867, provided for a rather pretentious public school system, but all the benefits were limited to whites. This was the direct contradiction to the accordance passes at the Constitutional Convention of 1864. The Constitution of 1868 provided for the maintenance of the system of free public schools for the gratuitous instruction of all persons in the state between the ages 5 and 20. On July 23rd, 1868, Governor Clayton approved the law under which education was to be carried on. A state board of education had been begun under the lessee system and continued under the Freedmen's Bureau, but this was the first time that civil government had made any provision for it. The expense of public school education was to be taken care by taxation. The masses, black and white, were unprepared for this. Competent teachers were scarce, and school officials were often indifferent. This made the situation very trying. Nevertheless, the work of organization was begun on August 1st, 1868, with Thompson Smith as state superintendent. The Freedmen's Bureau turned over to school authorities all schools under its control, and entered heartily with the development of black schools under the new order. In March 1869, a few schools were reported organized. On June 15th, 1869, the Daily Republican claimed that there were, quote, in successful operation, nearly, if not quite, 300 schools, end quote. School funds were reduced somewhat in the fall of 1869 because of tax collectors squandering the proceeds. As a result, many schools' terms were cut and others were closed completely, but some continued. Teachers were, as a rule, inefficient. White teachers in black schools were held in contempt. The textbooks were finally fixed by the school board, and occasionally the Democratic press demanded that only books of Southern production be used. J.C. Cordon, a black graduate of Oberlin, was superintendent of education from January 16, 1873 to October 30th, 1874. Under the Democratic administration, the schools were closed during the years of 1874 to 1875, and the attendance of 1876 was only 8% of the school population. But from that time onward, it gradually increased from year to year. Quote, the year of 1870 remained the higher watermark in school attendance for a period of at least 20 years. In Texas, as a result of the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, the educational work which was under the charge of Lieutenant E.M. Wheelock, advanced to such an extent that by the end of January 1865, there were in operations 26 days and night schools with an enrollment of about 1,600 pupils. These schools were supported partly by voluntary contributions, partly by small tuition fees. The number of pupils enrolled in the school September 1st, 1866 was over 4,543 teachers. When the Senate Republican Party was organized, they advocated free common schools and free homesteads out of the public land, open to all without distinction of color or race. During the convention of 1868 to 1869, the Committee of Education reported that there were provisions for increasing the existent permanent school funds by aiding to it all money to be received from the sale of the public domain, and for applying all the available funds to the education of all children within the scholastic age, from 6 to 18 years, without distinctions of race or color. The public school system in Texas was at first in a large measure a failure because the popular hostility to the admission of black people to public schools, coupled with inefficient management by counties. In the convention which reconstructed Louisiana in 1864, the bank system of schools was discussed, and there was a motion to declare it unconstitutional, but it was finally approved by a vote of 72 to 9. There was, however, a great diversity of opinion as to the ways and means of providing for the system. It was decided at first to establish schools for supported by white taxation, and schools for black people to be supported by black taxation. It was argued that unless this measure was adopted, white and black people might be compelled to attend the same schools. The friends of the freeman feared that he would suffer by separate taxation. And more of the previous resolution, Terry moved some 3 weeks later that there should be no separate taxation of the races, and that the legislator should provide for the education of all children between the ages of 6 and 18 by the maintenance by taxation or otherwise of free public schools. This provision, being adopted by a vote of 53 to 27, was incorporated into the Constitution. By the Constitution of 1868, all children were admitted to the public school regardless of color. The law thus provided for compulsory mixed schools, a condition which prevailed until 1877. As a matter of fact, there were not a great many cases of where children of color were pupils in white schools, so that the mixed schools were not universally prevalent. The children of Governor Pinchback, for example, were escorted to a white school by a policeman, but often run off by white hoodlums after the policeman had disappeared. Freemansboro was a salvation. The Freemansboro was a salvation for black education. In Kentucky, by the middle of 1866, 35 black schools had been established with 58 teachers. The number increased to 139 in 1869, and in 1866, there were 58 teachers with the enrollment of 4,122 pupils. An average attendance of 3,212 was maintained. In 1869, the number of teachers had reached to 1,080 and the pupils of 18,891. Most of the teachers were black people, with a few whites from the north. The revenue for these schools was obtained from state tax levies on black people, private donations, and sometimes tuition fee. By a law passed in 1866, all black taxes, including poll tax, were to be divided equally between black schools and black paupers. In 1867, an additional poll tax of $2 was levied on black people, but it was soon repealed in 1871 after considerable black opposition. In 1873, black people also threatened to appeal to the state and federal courts to obtain, by legal process, equal school advantages. Not until the advent of Satch F. Smith as state superintendent of education in 1867, did public school education in Kentucky take a new growth. In 1869 election, the people voted to increase the school taxes to 20 mil on the dollar. By 1871, the school recipients had increased from less than $400,000 in 1869 to almost $1 million. The number of districts from 4,477 to 5,177. The number of pupils from 376,000 to 405,000. In the District of Columbia, black people began their self-support schools in 1807, led by 3 former slaves. A great educational movement began. Other schools followed during the early 19th century, and finally efforts to start a free school system for black people in the districts were made in 1856. The project was overwhelmingly defeated by white voters at the polls. In 1862, May 21st, Congress passed an act providing that 10% of the taxes collected from people of color be appropriated to establish public schools for black people. Jesus Christ. Fuck white people. Fuck us. 3 trustees for black schools in Washington and Georgetown were appointed by the Secretary of Interior, but even the meager funds thus provided were only in part turned over to black people. For 2 years, only $736 had been credited to the schools of color funds, and the first public school for black people was not open until March 1864. In 1864, another act became the fundamental school law for the whole district. This provided that the authority should set apart every year from all its recipients for educational purposes such proportionate parts, therefore, as the number of children of color between the ages of 6 to 17 years in respective cities bear to the whole number, therefore, for the purpose of establishing and sustaining public schools in said cities for the education of children of color. In 1866, Congress appropriated $10,000 to purchase school sites and erect buildings, and after these laws, black people began to receive a just proportion of the school funds. It was not until the year 1867 that these trustees obtained sufficient funds to undertake the establishment of any considerable number of schools. Previous to that time, for about 3 years, from 60 to 80 schools of color had been maintained at a large expense by various benevolent associations in the northern states. There was 26 private schools in 1864, and between 1860 and 1864, $135,000 was contributed by philanthropists for the work. After this, for several years, the white and I don't know how to do this. School systems of color were practically separated, each with their own superintendent. Finally, about 1890, one general superintendent with white and assistant of color under his combined the school systems. So if I do something weird, it's because they put the word color before the next term, and it's just like, oh, I can't do that. I can't do that. In Delaware, your early attempts at the education of youth people of color were made by black people themselves. And it was not until 1875 that schools for black people had any recognition by the state. By personal tax, tuition fees, and voluntary contributions, these people were able to keep up the work of education until the General Assembly of the state assumed the responsibility in 1881. So black people were keeping everything going. Fuck. Since that date, the work of educating black people has been a matter of public concern. Well, didn't fucking fix it. With much discrimination against schools of color. In the border states, the development of black schools was somewhat different. Missouri and West Virginia established free schools with about the same time that the other states did and made provisions for black people. Tennessee was slower, with Maryland, like Delaware, refused to provide children of color at first, and for a long time granted them only the taxes raised among themselves. Not until 1880 were children of color generally in border states put on a legal footing with other children in education. It will be noted, we're doing pretty good. It will be noted that in nearly all the southern states, there were continuing and well-proven charges of peculation and misuse of public school funds. This was not a part of the general charge of stealing and grift, but it was the fault of local county officials, in most cases the leading white landholders who took no part in the administration of the state, nevertheless kept their hands upon local taxation and assessments, and were determined that the impoverished property holders should not be taxed for black education. By various methods, direct and indirect, they thus continually diverted the school funds, and this class of white people were primarily the ones responsible for such dishonesty, as there was in an administration of local and school funds. On the other hand, there were black people and poor white officials where here and there who were guilty of wasting and theft. During and after Reconstruction, diversion of school funds was common. In North Carolina, $136,076 was collected for education in 1870, but the Department of Education received only $38,931. Jesus Christ. In Louisiana, $1 million worth of bonds for the school, making sure, found were used to pay the expenses of legislators in 1872. In Texas, a large part of the income of public lands, which belonged to the educational fund, was lost. Go figure. In 1870, the school funds in Georgia were partially used for other purposes, and in 1874, Alabama school funds were diverted. In Tennessee, from 1866 to 1869, only 47% of the school taxes were spent on schools. In nearly every state, the question of mixed and separate schools was a matter of much debate and strong feelings. There is no doubt that black people in general wanted mixed schools. They wanted the advantage of contact with white children, and they wanted to have this evidence and proof of their equality. In addition to this, they were strengthened in their stand by white northern leaders, who pointed out the practical difficulties of two separate school systems of schools, which must, at an extent, duplicate efforts and would certainly greatly increase cost. In many of the states, the matter was left in abeyance. I don't know how to say this word. Ambiance. Oops, wrong one. Wrong phone. Sorry, wrong phone, everybody. I think it's ambience. Not sure. We're gonna find out. Abeyance. Abeyance. Okay, abeyance, my bad. And in some states, like Louisiana, mixed schools were established. This raised a fury of opposition among the whites. Of course it did. But for reasons of economy and democracy, it was obviously the best policy. Propaganda of race hatred made it eventually impossible, and a separate school system was increased. The cost of public education in the South that day resulted in a slowing down of the school system, and eventually in making the black children bear the burden of the increased cost, so that even to this day, throughout the South, black children was from 1/2 to 1/10 as much spent on his education as the white child. And even then, the white child does not receive sufficient funds for the thorough elementary education. Separation by race was prohibited in the Constitution of South Carolina and Louisiana. In Atlanta, the Board of Education wanted mixed schools, but allowed separate schools when they were desired. Trustees of the Peabody Fund caused the dropping of a clause prohibited separate schools in the original draft of the Federal Civil Rights Bill, 1875. One Southern congressman's speech represented the strength of this fear. Woe be unto the political party which shall declare to the toiling yeoman, the honest laboring poor of the country, quote, our children are no better than a black person. Ew. If you think so, you shall not practice on that opinion. We are the rulers. We are the servants. We know what is best for you and your children. We are the millionaires. We are the millionaires. We who pay out of our pockets. You will take our money and you will send our children to select high schools, to foreign lands, there where no black person or no black people are. But you and you who are too poor to pay shall send your ragged, hungry, urchins to the common school on such terms as we dedicate, or keep them away to stray among the treacherous quicksand and shoals of life, to wander on the streets and learn to syllabus the alphabets of vice and crime, or stay home and, like blind Samson, in mental darkness, tramped barefoot and thread mills and unceasing toil. That dude sucks. All right, let's look at 7:30. Put 7:30 here. What's up, John? Add a bookmark. See how close we are. 7:30. Man, they just don't like black people getting education. They're gonna hurt us. Okay, we got 4 more pages, I think. All right, let's do 4 more pages and then we'll be done. No matter what. No matter what time it is. In the Reconstruction Constitution, state taxations of school was a new feature, unknown to the previous school laws of Alabama, Florida, Arkansas, and Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Quote, the principles of direct taxation was undoubtedly the most important contribution of the Reconstruction regime to the public school movement in the South. It was perpetuated in all the revisions of these constitutions after 1867, except in Alabama. The victory of home rule in 1876 was followed by a period of hostilities, or at least indifference, to public education in 1879. In Virginia, $1 million belonged to the school fund, had been used for other purposes. Of course it did. In Georgia, the legislature in 1876 destroyed $350,000 worth of bonds belonging to the school fund. Tennessee, in 1869, abolished the general tax for school purposes and the administrative system. The Alabama Constitution in 1875, instead of allocating 1/5 of the state revenue to education, which was a provision in the Constitution of 1869, substituted direct appropriation. In Arkansas, the income from land sales belonged to the school funds, which used for other purposes. There were similar reductions of school revenue in Louisiana. In Texas, a voluntary county system was substituted for the state system in 1875 and 1876. The public school system of the South was helped by the gifts of the Peabody Fund in 1867 and 1869. On the account of the influences mentioned, it became common throughout the South for all parties to pledge themselves to the cause of public schools. Yet, by some of those strange fatalities of history, the strongest of all influence for educational progress was the very one which during and just after the Reconstruction period undoubtedly checked the cause. That was the race issue, the movement to eliminate black people as a factor in politics involved an appeal of passion to prejudice and sometimes a misrepresentation of the part of the man of color in Southern progress. It was fair to say that black carpetbaggers, governments established the public school of the South. although recent research have shown many germs of public school systems in the South before the war, and they were all white, like black people, it seems like, there can be no reasonable doubt that common school instruction in the South, and in modern sense of the term, was founded by the Freedmen's Bureau and missionary societies, and that the state public school system was formed mainly by black Reconstruction governments. See, black people. Fucking hell. Dunning says, quote, free public education existed in only a rudimentary and sporadic form in the South before the war, but the new Constitution provides generally for a complete system on the advanced Northern model. They could have just like added, if they wanted, and asked permission to like add on and build the infrastructure. You know, Jesus Christ. Because they were black, they're like, no, we're not doing that. Colonel Richard P. Hallowell, almost looks like Halloween, adds, quote, the whites had always regarded the public school system in the North with contempt. The freemen introduced and established it, and it stands today a living testimony, end quote. From the beginning of the public school system under Reconstruction and after, the fight between local and state control and supervision has been bitter. Local control meant the control of property and racial particularism. It stood for reaction and prejudice, and wherever there was retrogression, particularly in black schools, it can be traced to the increased power of the county and district administrators. This accounts for the difficulties, corruptions, and failures in Alabama and South Carolina, particularly in most of the southern states. For this first success of black schools, the South deserved little praise. From the beginning, most of the southern states made black schools just as bad as they dared to in the face of national public opinion. And every cent spent to them was taken from black rent and wages and come back to the property holders to unfold and increase opportunities for exploitation. It is said, for instance, in one state, quote, there were to be free public schools. Black people were to be the chief beneficiaries of the new system, but the whites would pay the taxes. Whites considered such education either useless, or positively dangerous to society. Of course they did. Of free self-sacrificing gifts for the sake of black people uplift and intelligence. The vast majority of Southern white people contributed almost nothing. In recent years, under the influence of educational leaders like Atticus Haygood and James Dillard, the support of black education in some Southern states have become more enlightened and generous. This is particularly true in North Carolina, West Virginia, and Texas. Improvements over usually bad conditions may be noted also in Louisiana, Virginia, and Delaware. The situation of North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi is still reactionary and deplorable, while the improvements in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky is not great. Finally, the movement that saved black public school system was not enlightened Southern opinion, but rather the Northern philanthropy, which at the very beginning of the black education movement contributed towards the establishment of black colleges. The reason for them at first was to supply the growing demand for teachers, and was also a concession to Southern prejudice, which so violently disliked the white teachers in black schools. This led to the establishment by 1879 of 84 normal and high school and 16 colleges with over 12,000 students. But these institutions soon saw a higher mission. In the midst of the reaction and disenfranchisement of poverty and growing caste, they became the centers of a training of leadership, an ideal for the whole black race, and only find a neutral field of contact between white and black culture. The father of 40 years ago anticipated the criticism of later years as the wisdom of college for the development of a backward race, blah, blah, blah. White people are the backward race, sorry. So they said, let it be granted that our lines of education are imperative. Colleges are needed. We must set the standard for the education of race now. Thorough training, large knowledge, and the best culture possible are needed to invigorate, direct, purify, and broaden life. Needed for the wise administration of citizens, the duties of which are as sure to come as the sun is to shine, though today or tomorrow may be cloudy. Needed to overcome narrowness and one-sidedness and incompleteness. Howard University and Freeman's Hospital are survivals of the Freeman's Bureau. Howard University was chartered in 1867. A General O.O. Howard, head of the Freeman's Bureau, was made its first president. Succeeding as president were W.W. Patton, J.E. Rankin, who wrote God Be With You Until We Meet Again, and John Gordon, a lineal descendant of Jonathan Edwards. On its governing board have been Douglas Langston and Bruce. It was the largest black medical center in the United States and has furnished about half of the black lawyers. Bray College was started by John G. Fee, a Kentuckian who became an abolitionist. After the war, students of color were admitted, and the brother of the president of Oberlin was at the head of the school. For 40 years, students of color attended Bray. But finally, in 1904, the institution was by law closed to black people. Of course it was. Can't give black people any heads up. Gotta keep them down. Hampton Institute was founded by General C.S.C. Armstrong near where black people were first made. Contraband of war. The contraband of war was them like running away from their slave owners and stuff like that, because the North wanted to keep the plantations stabilized. So some of them returned the slaves back to the plantations because they didn't want to free black people. Black people freed themselves. That's what they're called. They're called contraband because they had to engage and they had to purposely take them in. And where a woman of color found the first school of color. Among these trustees were Mark Hopkins, Phillips Brooke, and John G. Winter. Atlanta University was founded by Edmund Ware in 1867. I have gone on as president Ware did during. Wait, make sure. Okay, yeah. I have gone as a president Ware did during those early years. There must have been in his heart deathless love and pity for men who needed what he could give them, a faith in the gospel and internal righteousness that never wavered, and a love for God that made work easy and suffering joy. I don't understand. I don't agree with the suffering joy. What? The narrator has a first day? I don't understand that. I guess I'm the narrator. And to this, the picture of DeForest and Telegad, Carveth and Fisk and others at Bibbled, Knoxville, New Orleans, in Central Tennessee. There were those who influential schools at the edge of the South, Lincoln in Pennsylvania and the Wilberforce in Ohio. Nearly all of these educational leaders were either nominated by Howard Head of the Freeman's Bureau, as in the case for General S.C. Armstrong, or received from him the most thoroughgoing cooperation. There is no greater tribute to the Freeman's Bureau than this. Propaganda has centered the attention of the world upon these Northerners who took part in the political construction of the South, and particularly upon those who were charged with dishonesty, while of the history of this astonishing movement to plant the New England College in the South and to give the Southern black man a leadership based on scholarship and character. Almost nothing has been said, and yet this was the salvation of the South and the black people. These carpetbaggers, quote unquote, deserve to be remembered and honored. Without them, there can be no doubt that black people would have rushed into revolt and vengeance and played into the hands of those determined to crush him. It was, as it was when reaction triumphed in 1867, there was already present a little group of trained leadership which grew by leaps and bounds until it gripped and held the mass of black people at the beginning of the 20th century. Had it not been for black schools and college, black people would to all intents of purposes have been driven back to slavery. His economic foothold and land and capital was too slight in 10 years of turmoil to affect any defense and stability. His Reconstruction leadership had come from black education, and in the North, the white politician, capitalist, and philanthropic teacher. The counter-revolution in 1876 drove most of these save and the teachers away. But already this is why I'm coming to an end. Through establishing public schools and private colleges and by organizing the black church, black people had acquired enough leadership and knowledge to thwart the worst design of the new slave drivers. They avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to storm of beating, lynching, and murder, and kept their souls in spite of public and private insults of every description. They built an inner culture which the world recognized in spite of the fact that is still half strangled and inarticulate. So the world recognized that black people were trying to develop these infrastructures. And here's a poem. There is a wide wonder in it all, that from degraded rest and servile toil, the fiery spirit and the seer should call these simple children of the sun and soil. O black slave singer, gone forgot unfamed, you alone of all the long line of those who've sung untaught, unknown, unnamed, have stretched out upward, seek the divine. James Weldon Johnson. And we are done with this chapter. And we will start. Oh my gosh, what is that chapter? What's XV5? XV1 mean? Is it? Ooh, I don't know. Back Toward Slavery is the next one, and that's on page 738. Add a bookmark. 738. All right, so black schools, because of black people, why we're educated. Why we have education systems. They just appropriated all that shit. Hello. Speak it. Gotta unmute. Joe.
Sorry, I'm back. I had you.
Nope, now you're muted again. Now you're gone. Oh, TikTok hates them. TikTok hates him. They said one thing and they... Oh, that's funny. Kind of funny. That's kind of funny. Hi, Joe. You're back. You got to unmute.
Right.
What happened?
TikTok. Anyways, so I really enjoyed this one and learning more about how hard schools were taught and fought for, and then of course white people underfunding as usual and underallowing and burning down and doing everything else white people do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, stealing and all that stuff for their own benefits and their own gains.
Of course.
You know, it's just a projection because white people are like, we white people are scared of someone being put above us. I think we have this inferior complex, but we portray it as we're inferiority. But what we really have problems with is worrying about being less than another person. That's where that is,
Yeah.
you know. And black people, all they want is like they were even advocating for white children too, and they're advocating for mixed schools, you know. But you know how that worked, so it's just black people just listen to black people, you know.
Yes, very much so.
All right, do you have anything to say before I close it out?
No, not really, but it was a really good reading, and it was really cool that we were able to end the chapter.
Yeah, it was cool. I wonder what the next chapter says. Return to slavery. So we're gonna find out what that means. I wonder if it's dealing with the prison system and stuff. You know, I don't know. We'll find out. But what does XV1 stand for? Is that 25? Or is that 15?
1. That would be 26. No, that would be 16.
16. Okay, let me try this. XVI. It says 17. No, I put II, my bad. Yeah, you're right, 16. I don't know why I put II. II. Yeah, we're on 16.
Okay, cool.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope everybody liked the reading. I'm sorry if I read fast. I guess I'm just in the zone today with reading. So, all right, everybody. I wish everybody a good night.